Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClair, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. There's a sound the old railroads used to make at sundown, a low rolling groan that settled into the bones of the Delta like an old man easing down into a porch chair. I grew up listening to that sound drifting over the Cypress line, and I'll tell you something most folks don't understand. Trains weren't just machines down here. They were living things. They breathed steam, they sweated grease, and they carried the heartbeat of a whole region on steel ribs that never stopped humming. And among all the men who ever climbed into a locomotive cab, none stood taller in the stories passed down around here than Jonathan Luther Casey Jones. Folks know the version the newspapers like to print, the hero engineer who rode his train straight into the jaws of death to save everyone behind him. But that's the pretty version, the one fit for school books. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the one that ain't written down. The one railroad men whispered about when the lanterns burned low and the wind blew strange along the tracks. Now, I've never been one to chase after ghost stories just for the thrill of it, but there are some tales that sit too heavy to ignore, and Casey Jones carries the kind of weight that don't come from metal or martyrdom. The weeks before his wreck were full of little things, the kind most folks would shrug off until they stacked too high to overlook. The first whisper came from down in Mississippi, from an old track walker who swore he saw something following Casey's engine one dusky evening, a big black dog walking the rails as if it belonged there. Now, around here, a black dog on the tracks ain't a stray or a curiosity. It's a death omen older than the railroad itself, brought over in the bones of hoodoo folklore and hammered into railroad superstition like nails in a coffin. Men who spent their lives on the line believed in signs the same way farmers watched the sky, and a black dog pacing ahead of an engine meant only one thing. Somebody riding that train was marked. Some said Casey saw it too. Others said he pretended not to. I've heard old men argue this point across a dozen porch steps, but the truth is hard to pin down when the past refuses to sit still. What we do know is this. The dog appeared more than once. Always at a distance, always trotting just ahead of the engine, never turning back, never leaving tracks in the gravel. One fireman claimed the dog's shadow stretched longer than its body, thin and warped like something caught between this world and the next. Folks laughed at him for a while, but they stopped laughing when he quit the railroad and wouldn't talk about those last weeks running with Casey. But that wasn't the only strange thing stirring around him. Casey told a few friends, quiet-like, in the kind of voice a man uses when he's halfway embarrassed by his own nerves, that he kept hearing humming in the caboose. Not workers, not passengers, not the creaking of metal. He said it sounded like a woman humming a tune too soft to place, drifting through the empty cars after midnight when the lantern light thinned and the train slipped into that long rhythm that makes you feel like the whole world is rocking. A woman's hum inside an empty caboose is a sound meant for nightmares, but Casey didn't scare easy. Still, he mentioned it more than once, and men who heard him swear there was something in his tone they'd never heard before, like doubt or maybe dread, tugging at the edges of a man who usually carried himself like the rails bent for him alone. And then there was the conjure woman in Jackson. Now listen here, folks. I ain't telling you hoodoo and railroad work were best friends, but they shook hands more often than people today realize. Railroad men were practical men, but practicality down here includes a healthy respect for the invisible. So when Casey stopped in Jackson and made his way to a little shotgun house behind the tracks, folks took notice. They say he slipped inside near twilight and didn't come out for a good 20 minutes. What happened inside depends on who's doing the telling. Some say he asked for protection from a run of bad luck. Others say he was warned about something riding ahead of him on the line. But the detail that stuck, the one that shows up in every version no matter who's speaking, is the mojo bag. Casey walked out of that house with a small red flannel pouch tied tight at the top with 3 knots. Those bags weren't toys or souvenirs. A true mojo bag is a working charm. Herbs, bones, roots, bits of metal, maybe a coin or two fixed by someone who knows what they're doing. It's meant to hold something off or draw something in. You don't wear one unless you need one. Railroad men recognized it instantly, and Casey didn't try to hide it. He kept it in the left pocket of his overalls, close to the heart. When someone asked him about it, he said only that it was meant to keep the reaper off his heels. Men laughed it off at first, because Casey was the kind of engineer who ran like he was born on steel instead of flesh. But that laughter faded quick when the omens piled up like storm clouds. There were stories of cold spots in the cab when the boiler was roaring hot, drafts that moved against the wind, and lanterns that flickered for no reason at all. The closer it got to April of 1900, the more the old heads muttered that Casey was running with something he shouldn't have been. Railroad superstition is strange that way. Men would sit on 100 tons of iron barreling through the night at 50 miles an hour without blinking, but show them one omen and they'd shiver like a possum in snow. I remember hearing these tales from my own father, who heard them from his father, who worked the rails long enough to know the difference between a story and a warning. He told me that when a man like Casey, steady-handed, clear-headed, proud enough to make the engines listen, starts carrying charms and speaking of voices in empty cars, the world is shifting under him in ways no mortal training can fix. And pride, Lord help us, is the thing that gets most men killed. Casey was beloved up and down the line, but he had an arrogance to him that made rivals bristle. Some say he pushed too hard, bragged too loud, and took something from another engineer that wasn't his to take. But that tale belongs to another night. Right now, I'm telling you about the signs that closed in around him like fog on a Tennessee morning. The last week before the wreck, the black dog appeared again. This time closer, this time staring straight at the engine as if it were waiting. A brakeman swore its eyes glowed like coal in the ash bin. Another man said the dog's shadow lagged behind, stretched thin as wire, no matter where the sun stood. And the humming, Lord, that humming, started up again on the night before Casey's final run. Men working the caboose said no woman boarded, no passenger walked near it, no voice was present. But they heard it clear as crystal, a lullaby in a minor key drifting through the wooden walls like mist. One man quit on the spot. Another refused to ride in the caboose again, said he'd work freight or nothing at all. And Casey? Well, Casey tightened that mojo bag's knots and climbed into his engine like he always did. But the fireman who rode with him later said his hands trembled once before he steadied them. Just once. But once is enough to know a man is wrestling something inside. Folks always want to know why Casey didn't stay home that night. Why he didn't take the omens as they were meant. Why he didn't heed the warnings whispered from track to track. But I'll tell you something you won't hear in any ballad. Casey Jones wasn't running from fate. He was running to meet it. Some men sense when the end is close. They lift their heads and smell the wind the same way a horse senses fire. And those men, proud men, stubborn men, they don't hide. They face the dark head-on so nobody else has to. Now, as much as the hero story gets told, nobody ever talks about what his widow said afterward. She claimed that when they found his body after the wreck, the pocket where that mojo bag should have been was empty. Not torn, not burned, not opened, just empty. As if someone, or something, slipped it out the moment Casey breathed his last. And that, my friends, is where the tidy stories fall apart and the real one begins to crawl up from the grave. Down here in the South, we know the difference between a man who dies clean and a man who dies claimed. And I'll tell you right now, Casey Jones died claimed. Folks like to talk about Casey Jones like he rode through life with nothing but clean steam in his lungs and heroism in his veins. But every legend has a shadow, and Casey's was cast by a man named Simeon Red McCullough. Now I'll tell you right off, Red wasn't a villain out of a dime novel. He was a railroad man through and through, the kind who could smell a loose spike before the train even hit the curve. But he carried a temper sharp enough to cut through steel and pride thicker than molasses in January. He and Casey started off friendly enough, but the rails don't like two men with the same fire in their gut. Inevitably, they collided. And it wasn't the kind of collision that throws sparks. It was the kind that burns slow and steady until somebody finally explodes. I first heard their story from an old telegraph operator who used to sit outside the Canton station sipping chicory coffee and tapping his cane against the planks like he was keeping time for ghosts. He said the trouble started over schedules. Casey had a habit of running hot, arriving early, pushing his engine to limits the inspectors didn't appreciate. Red McCullough, on the other hand, ran cold and steady. He followed every posted time as if God himself wrote it in stone. When dispatchers started favoring Casey's speed over Red's precision, resentment began simmering like a pot left too long on the stove. But the real spark, according to the old man tapping his cane, was the night Red's engine stalled outside Memphis. Casey was sent to pull a relief run, and when he arrived, the yard boss made a big show of praising his quick response. Said something like, "Jones, you saved this railroad more trouble in a week than some men do in a lifetime." Red was standing 10 feet away, covered in soot, jaw clenched so tight his teeth nearly cracked. Casey, in that big booming way of his, slapped Red on the back and told him, "Don't worry, partner, some of us were born to run ahead." Now, maybe he meant it as a joke. Maybe it was just Casey being Casey, bold, bright, unaware of the sting his pride carried. But Red took it as an insult carved deep enough to scar. From that day on, he treated Casey like a thorn in his boot. He muttered about him in the break rooms and grumbled about him in the yard. Men tried to patch up the rift, but pride is a stubborn horse that won't take a bit once it's been spooked. Red started claiming Casey cut corners, said he gambled with passengers' lives by pushing his engine too hard. He called him a showboat, a glory hound. And when a man's pride turns bitter, his tongue starts to drip poison. Some of the new hires listened, others shrugged it off. But the older hands knew trouble was brewing. The real break came one sticky afternoon in Jackson. Red and Casey crossed paths near the switching tower, and Red made a snide remark about how some engineers only survive because luck's too dumb to quit 'em. Casey shot back with something sharper. Nobody remembers the exact words because tempers were running hotter than boiler pressure. But it ended with Casey laughing loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear. Men say Red's face turned the color of old blood. One brakeman swore he saw Red mutter something under his breath, something that didn't sound like English or any prayer he knew. That's when the whispering started. Now, let me be clear. Hoodoo ain't evil. It ain't black magic or wickedness. It's older than those railroad lines, older than the towns they connected, older than the men who feared it and the ones who respected it. Hoodoo is a work in practice, roots, signs, blessings, curses when they're deserved. But you don't throw a curse lightly. You don't even speak one unless you're willing to shoulder the consequences. And by all accounts I've heard across my life, Red McCullough went to see someone. Some say a two-headed doctor near Vicksburg. Others say a conjure woman from a line older than Mississippi mud. And he asked for something no decent man should ask for. He wanted Casey's luck broken. When a curse is made out of pride instead of pain, it lands crooked. And crooked curses come back around like a bad penny. Old railroaders told me that Red came back from that visit with a strange calm about him, the kind that makes a man more dangerous than rage ever could. He worked his roots in silence, humming to himself sometimes, eyes hollow around the edges like he wasn't fully inside his own body. He stopped eating with the other men, stopped laughing, stopped acknowledging Casey altogether. People noticed. Folks always notice when a man starts slipping into the shadows of his own making, and it wasn't long before the strange signs that circled Casey began circling Red too. Lanterns flickering without wind, tools going missing and turning up in places they didn't belong, crows gathering on telegraph poles like they were waiting for a sermon. One story I heard from a conductor who'd been working the line 30 years longer than I'd been alive stuck with me more than any other. He said Red walked past him one night in the roundhouse, and the air turned cold enough to make his breath fog. Red didn't look at him, didn't even blink, just walked through that cold patch like he was passing through a doorway into somewhere else entirely. That man was hollowing out, the conductor said, like something crawled inside him and started eating him from the center outward. Now, pride will make a man stupid, but spite will make him reckless. Rumor has it Red made a packet, some call it a crossing bag, others say it was a trick bag, meant to bind Casey's luck and twist it until it turned poisonous. Whether he left it on Casey's engine or buried it near the tracks, nobody knows. But what folks agreed on was that Red wanted Casey to feel fear, not pain, not death, fear. He wanted Casey to know he wasn't invincible. But hoodoo, real hoodoo, don't work like an adjustable wrench. You can't control its reach once it's loosed. A curse moves like smoke. It finds cracks. It seeps into places you didn't intend. And if you cast a curse with hate in your blood, it'll circle back until it tastes you too. The weeks before the wreck were sharp with tension. Men avoided standing between Red and Casey. Conversations died when one of them stepped into earshot. And then came the moment that sealed Red's fate in the long run. Casey apologized. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he felt the weight of the signs pressing down on him. Maybe he just wanted peace. But he approached Red behind the depot one evening and tried to mend the tear. Red rejected him flat, turned away without a word. Witnesses say his hands shook, not with anger but with something colder, fear maybe, or regret. And that trembling, God bless it, was the closest he'd ever come to stepping back from the edge. By then, Casey was already wearing the mojo bag, already hearing the humming, already seeing the black dog. Red should have known better. He should have pulled back, but pride held him fast, like a trap. Men say he spat on the ground after Casey walked away and muttered, "He ain't outrunning what's coming." But here's the thing about curses. They have a funny way of choosing their own targets. And when Casey died in that crash, the curse didn't lift. Not one bit. It just got hungry for a new name to latch onto. Red McCullough began to unravel. Slowly, quietly, terribly. His engine stalled more. His hands shook when he tried to light his lantern. He reported hearing knocking inside his cab when the boiler was cold. One night he swore he saw a shadow standing on the tracks, tall as a man but shaped wrong, like someone stretched a silhouette until it thinned to the width of a memory. Railroad men avoid talking about what happened to Red in the months after Casey died, but the stories exist. The truth sits in the pauses between breaths. One engineer said Red woke screaming in his bunk car, shouting that someone was blowing Casey's whistle right outside his window. Another said Red refused to cross a certain bridge because he claimed he saw Casey standing at the far end, lantern glowing blue, motionless as a gravestone. And then, one night, Red McCullough vanished, just gone. His engine returned to the yard with no engineer aboard, running slow, headlight dark. They found his gloves on the floor of the cab. Nothing else. No sign of struggle, no sign of flight. Some say he fell from the train. Others say he stepped off on purpose. But most old railroad men who knew the rails breathe and remember, say Casey came back for him. Not out of vengeance, out of justice. Because the curse Red called down didn't belong to Casey. It belonged to him. Whenever you hear Casey's whistle on a night with no train scheduled, you ain't hearing a haunting. You're hearing a reminder that some debts don't get buried, not even under steel and steam. I spent enough years listening to old railroad men on porches and depot benches to know this much. The rail lines across Mississippi and Tennessee weren't just strips of steel hammered into the dirt. They were thresholds, boundaries, places where the living and the unseen brushed up against each other so close you could feel the hair rise on your arms if you stood between the tracks at dusk. Folks who never worked the rails think of trains as mechanical beasts, loud and predictable, but the men who spent their lives tending them knew better. They believed in signs, real signs, not the kind a preacher reads from a pulpit, but the ones that show themselves in the corner of your eye, in the tremble of a lantern flame, in the way gravel shifts under your feet when no wind blows at all. Those signs weren't superstition to them. They were survival. And Casey Jones wasn't the first nor the last to be shadowed by things the railroad couldn't explain, no matter how hard it tried. Back when I was a boy, my daddy used to take me to the old Yazoo yard on Saturdays. The place smelled of creosote and coal dust, and the roundhouse echoed like a cavern full of restless bones. You'd see men with their sleeves rolled up, polishing brass and checking valve gears, but their real work, their quiet work, was watching the signs. They kept rabbits' feet tied inside their boots, chalk crosses on the backs of their lanterns, and pieces of broken rail in their coat pockets. Some carried railroad spikes rusted just enough to be alive with the right energy. Others rubbed brick dust over the engine wheels before a run, because someone told them once that brick dust confuses wandering spirits. The railroad didn't train them to do that. Life did. They believed a train carried more than passengers and freight. It carried energy, fate, if you want to call it that, and fate left marks. They'd say the whistle of a train changed its tone depending on whether the run was blessed or cursed. On a blessed run, the whistle sounded clean, sharp, like the air parted willingly. On a cursed run, it dragged low, wavered on its tail end, and left a ringing hum that lingered long after the sound should have died. Engineers could tell the difference. They'd never admit it out loud in front of a railroad inspector, but the men who actually kept the lines moving understood it perfectly. There were omens they watched for, some common as dirt, others rare enough to chill a man straight through his bones. A cross tie split clean down the middle for no reason meant a death was coming on the line. A lantern that wouldn't stay lit meant someone riding that train was traveling with a burden that didn't belong to them. A crow perched on the smokestack at dawn meant the engine wanted to rest. But the worst omen, the one nobody ignored, was the dog. Always the dog. A black dog walking the tracks didn't belong to any man, and it didn't bark or chase squirrels. It watched. It walked ahead of the engine like a silent messenger. Railroad men called it the graveyard dog. Hoodoo workers called it the death dog. Some said it was the spirit of a man killed on the line. Others said it was something older, something that walked the boundaries between the worlds. Either way, when the death dog showed up, every man on that run felt it deep in his chest. And that dog stalking Casey? It wasn't the first time the creature showed itself. There are stories going back decades. One old engineer named Harlan Thigpen swore the dog appeared the night before a boiler explosion in '84. Said it stood on the track with its head bowed, like it was praying. Another conductor claimed he saw it right before his brake car detached on a curve and rolled half a mile backward without killing a soul. The dog always appeared for a reason, and never a small one. Then there was the humming. Now let me tell you something people outside the South often misunderstand. Hoodoo ain't the same as voodoo. Hoodoo is a working practice. Root work, signs, conjure. It ain't a religion. It's survival stitched together from African knowledge, native wisdom, and centuries of pain pressed down into magic that does what it needs to do. And one of the oldest hoodoo signs, older than the railroads, older than half the towns along the line, is the sound of a woman humming where no woman should be. That's a death omen, too. When Casey said he heard humming in the caboose that was empty, locked, and sealed for the night, every man within earshot felt the blood run cold. They knew that sound. They'd heard stories of it whispered by firemen who only lasted a few weeks before quitting and going back to farming. They said the humming always came from the farthest point of the train, the part closest to departure, closest to the end of the line. It wasn't a song, not exactly. It was a warning disguised in a mother's lullaby. Gentle, soft, but wrong. Men who heard it and lived long enough to talk about it said the humming made the air feel heavy, like you were breathing through warm syrup. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It didn't feel like it came from the walls or the floor. It felt like it came from behind you, even when you were alone. There were stories of brakemen throwing down their lanterns and running off into the woods rather than take another step toward that sound. Some never came back. And then there were the charms, the little protections railroad men used when the world started acting strange. My daddy kept a bottle of railroad holy water in his toolbox. It wasn't church holy water. It was water collected at a crossroads at midnight, mixed with a pinch of graveyard dirt and a prayer said in a whisper. He said it kept the bad luck off the wrenches. He wasn't joking. A lot of engineers carried gree-gree, small amulets from conjure workers. Usually they were meant to protect against death or misfortune, but they had to be personalized. A charm given to the wrong man could do more harm than good. Some men carried high john root tied in red thread. Others carried lodestones to pull good luck their way. But when a man carried a mojo bag, for protection against the reaper no less, that was serious work. Not for vanity, and not for show. Casey's mojo bag wasn't typical. A normal bag might have a pinch of sulfur, a silver dime, a piece of a mirror, a root or two. But men said Casey's bag was thicker, heavier. Like the conjure woman gave him more than just protection, maybe a warning inside the charm itself. Some swore she looked afraid when she handed it to him, and conjure women don't scare easy. And Lord knows, once a man asks for protection, something already has its eye on him. But here's the thing, most folks don't understand. Hoodoo ain't all warnings and dark omens. There's light in it too. Hope. The belief that the world isn't helpless, that you can fight back even when fate's got a grip on your collar. Railroad men lived by that balance. They believed in the signs, but they believed in their own hands too. They believed a man could outrun bad luck if he rode with courage, if he listened to the rails and respected their warnings. Casey listened. That much I'm sure of. A man who didn't believe wouldn't carry that charm. A man who didn't fear wouldn't mention the humming. A man who didn't feel the weight of fate wouldn't watch for the black dog the way he did. But he also believed in the machine. In the rhythm of the pistons, the heartbeat of the engine, the firebox glow that cast shadows up the cab walls like restless spirits. The railroad was his church, and every run was a prayer. And that's why the omens hit men so hard when they heard what happened. Casey wasn't reckless. He wasn't wild. He wasn't the kind of fool who ignored every warning the world threw at him. He saw the signs. He heard the signals. He felt the wrongness settling around him like fog off the Tallahatchie. But he kept climbing into that cab, kept lighting that boiler, kept blowing that whistle into the dark, because some men can't say no to the road they were born to run. A few months before the wreck, an old conductor named Silas Leadfoot Morgan sat Casey down during a layover and told him straight, "That dog ain't following you for fun. Something's hitching a ride on your name." Casey didn't laugh. He didn't shrug it off. He just nodded slow and said, "I know, but I ain't quittin'." Leadfoot said he saw something in Casey's eyes that night. A calm that wasn't natural, not fear, not defiance, acceptance. Like Casey knew he was on borrowed time and had decided he'd use every second of it. And from that moment on, every man who rode with Casey swore they felt the tracks hum differently under his engine. Not dangerous, not yet, just aware. Like the rails themselves were listening. People like to pretend the South is slow and sleepy, but down here, time has teeth. It bites when it wants to. And when Casey Jones started drawing those signs toward him, black dogs, humming voices, flickering lanterns, charms tightening in his pocket, the line between the living world and whatever lies beyond got thinner than the whistle steam drifting off his engine at dawn. By the time April rolled around, nobody doubted the truth anymore. Casey Jones wasn't running a train. He was running out of time. There's a moment before every railroad run when the world goes still, like the air itself knows something is about to shift. Men who work the rails will tell you it's the calm before the fire wakes up in the boiler, the quiet that settles between the hiss of steam and the first crank of the throttle. But the night Casey Jones stepped onto his engine for the last time, that quiet felt wrong, heavy, like the whole yard was holding its breath. Folks who were there said the sun hadn't even fully set when the shadows started pooling thicker than they should have around the wheels. One of the brakemen, a tough fellow named Henry Lattimore, swore he saw the silhouette of a woman standing near the caboose, didn't see her face, just her shape in the lamplight, long and still like she'd been carved from night itself. He looked away just long enough to spit and rub his eyes, and she was gone, not walked off, gone, like smoke blown off a candle. And that humming, Lord help us, that humming returned. Men on the platform said they heard it drifting through the cars before Casey even climbed into the cab. It wasn't coming from a passenger. It wasn't coming from the yard. It came from the train. Like the steel itself was remembering some old sorrow and singing it back into the world. A low, steady, wordless hum that made the hair rise on the backs of men's necks. Some looked around to find the source. Others pretended not to hear it. Railroad men were practical, but practicality don't erase fear. It only teaches you where to hide it. Casey arrived with his cap pulled low and that mojo bag tucked close against his chest. He didn't smile, didn't crack a joke, didn't do that little half salute he liked to give the firemen. Instead, he stepped onto the gravel with the kind of focus a man gets when he knows something's waiting for him on the other side of the night. His fireman, Simeon Webb, said later that Casey's eyes looked darker than usual. Not tired, not sick, just shadowed, like he'd seen something that didn't belong to this world and hadn't told a soul about it. Right as they were climbing aboard the engine, Henry, the same brakeman who'd seen the woman, said Casey paused at the bottom rung of the ladder. Not long, not enough for most folks to notice, but Henry noticed everything. He said Casey put a hand to his pocket, pressed 2 fingers against the mojo bag like he was making sure it was still tied tight. Then he looked down the line, toward the dark stretch of rail leading away from the yard, and whispered something Henry couldn't hear. The tone wasn't angry, it wasn't scared, it was almost resigned. Now the railroad recorded the departure as routine, nothing strange on paper, but paper never tells the real story. Men said the engine shook once, one hard jolt, before the wheels even started rolling. Not a mechanical jolt, not the kind that comes from a loose coupling or a bad piston. This was deeper, like something bumped the engine from underneath the tracks. The firebox hissed. A lantern swung though no wind touched it. And Casey, instead of cursing the equipment like he usually did, just gripped the controls and muttered, "Keep steady." They pulled out of the station at 9:30. Steam rose in thick white columns that should have drifted upward, but didn't. It curled sideways instead, hugging the engine like fog that didn't want to leave. Men on the platform crossed themselves. Others spat for luck. And more than one worker said he saw a black shape dart between the wheels before the train picked up full speed. The death dog was back. Only this time it wasn't trotting ahead of the train. It ran alongside it, slow at first, keeping pace as the engine crawled past the last switch. Then faster. One engineer who'd just clocked out said the dog's paws didn't make a sound on the gravel, didn't disturb a single stone. Its eyes glowed like lamp oil catching fire, and its shadow dragged long behind it, longer than any dog's should have been. Casey didn't look at it, didn't acknowledge it, didn't need to. Everyone who'd ever worked a cursed run knew you don't look a bad omen in the eye. You just pray you outrun it. Miles passed under the wheels, the rhythm of the rails beating like a troubled heartbeat. Simeon said the pressure gauge twitched more than normal. The boiler hissed unevenly at times, like the engine was struggling to breathe. But every time he reached for a wrench or glanced at Casey, the man simply nodded as if to say, "Keep her going. Don't question it." Somewhere near Vaughan, the humming came back. Not inside the caboose this time, not inside the cars. It came from the cab itself. Simeon described it as a woman's voice, gentle, mournful, and close enough to feel on the skin, like breath against the back of the neck. No lyrics, no melody you could pin down. Just that steady hum threading itself through the roar of the engine. He tried to speak to Casey over the noise, but Casey lifted one finger from the throttle, just one, and Simeon fell silent. That finger said everything. Not now, not here. Let it hum. When the humming stopped, the night went too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses down on the soul. Simeon later said it felt like the engine was floating, like the wheels had lifted off the tracks and were gliding through air. And in that unnatural stillness, Casey looked up from the gauges and said, "Something's on the line tonight." Not in fear, not in anger, in certainty, like he'd been expecting whatever lay ahead. And then the dog appeared. Again. This time, dead center on the tracks. It wasn't trotting. It wasn't pacing. It stood perfectly still, facing the oncoming train, eyes bright as twin lanterns. Simeon grabbed Casey's arm, but Casey didn't flinch. He eased the brake lever gently, not enough to stop the engine, just enough to show he knew what he was seeing. The dog didn't move, didn't blink. And the moment the train would have hit it head on, it vanished. Not leapt, not ran, vanished, like it had never been there at all. Casey inhaled once, deep and steady, then pushed the throttle forward. Most men would have prayed, or panicked. Casey pressed into the danger. That's who he was. And let me tell you what most folks don't know. Mechanical reports of that night show that a broken rail ahead, a stalled freight car, and a miscommunicated signal all converged into the perfect disaster. But old engineers will swear those were just the earthly parts of the story. The real disaster, the one that wrapped itself around that engine like a waiting shadow, had already chosen that night. When Casey rounded that blind curve near Vaughan, the stalled freight train appeared like a wall of iron and sorrow. Too close, too massive, too still. Simeon said he felt time stretch thin, like the universe inhaled with them. Casey threw the brakes full, sparks flying in yellow streams that lit the entire cab like the inside of a furnace. The wheels screamed. The boiler shuddered. The whole engine buckled under the force of its own fight. And over it all, over the roar, the screech, the trembling steel, Simeon swore he heard the humming again. Soft, calm, almost tender. As if the woman's voice was guiding Casey's hands, steadying him as he made the split-second choice that saved every life behind him and cost him his own. The crash thundered across the night like judgment. The cars shuddered. Wood snapped. Steel bent. And when the dust settled, Casey lay beneath the engine, one hand still wrapped around the brake. His face was peaceful. Too peaceful for a man caught in wreckage that violent. But the strangest part wasn't the serenity. It was what was missing. By the time they pulled him from the wreck, his pocket was torn open, not ripped by metal, not shredded by fire, but opened clean, like fingers had plucked the seams apart. And the mojo bag was gone. Not burned, not buried, gone. Men who saw it didn't talk about it for years. The railroad didn't file it in any report. Casey's widow swore she'd sewn that pocket tight herself and tied the bag with 3 knots that couldn't come undone without hands. But whatever claimed Casey Jones that night didn't want him protected. It wanted him. And every engineer since who's heard his ghost whistle on a night with no trains running knows the truth as well as I do. Casey didn't die alone. Something came for him, something followed him, and something walked away when the job was done. There's a strange kind of silence that falls over a crash site after the fire dies out. The steam stops hissing, and the shouting fades into whispers. It ain't the silence of peace. It's the silence of something unfinished, something watching. Men who've worked disasters on the rails will tell you that silence is the first sign the dead ain't settled yet. And the night Casey Jones met the end of the line, That silence settled across Vaughn like a heavy blanket laid over a restless child. I've heard every version of what happened when they pulled Casey's body out from under that engine, but the truth sits somewhere between the official reports and the whispers passed through generations of men who worked the rails long before OSHA and insurance paperwork tried to scrub the old world clean. The newspapers told it plain. Engineer dies heroically, hand on the brake, saving scores of passengers. They made him a martyr so quick you'd think the ink was waiting for the chance, but the men who were actually there, the firemen, the brakemen, the yard operators, saw things the papers couldn't print without sounding crazed. The first thing they noticed was Casey's expression. A man crushed under the front end of a speeding engine ought to look twisted with pain or frozen in fear, but Casey looked calm, too calm. His jaw was set, not clenched. His eyes were half-lidded, not wide. One witness said it looked like Casey had seen exactly what was coming and met it like he was greeting a familiar face. And then there was his pocket. I mentioned before that Casey kept his mojo bag tied with 3 knots, tucked against his heart like a shield. Those knots don't come loose. They don't slip. They don't open on their own. That pocket should have been closed, burned, soaked, torn, maybe, but closed. Instead, the pocket flap hung limp, the seams loosened clean, like someone opened it with careful fingers. Not ripped, not shredded. Opened. The men gathered round the body didn't know what to make of it. Some squinted, some swallowed hard, others backed away as though Casey might sit up at any moment and look them straight in the soul. The fireman, Simeon Webb, dropped to his knees and felt around the gravel, searching for the bag. He sifted through cinders and splintered wood, found broken glass, bent nails, scraps of Casey's gloves, but no bag. One of the yard bosses told him to stop, that it didn't matter. But Simeon wasn't looking for a trinket. He knew the conjure woman tied that bag with purpose. Protection ain't a small thing when a man asks for it, and when protection goes missing at the exact moment death arrives, men raised on southern soil know better than to call it coincidence. Now, Casey's widow, Janie, she learned about the missing bag within hours. Word traveled fast back then, faster than trains on good rails. She wasn't the hysterical sort. Folks said she carried herself with the same quiet strength Casey admired. But when she heard what Simeon found, or didn't find, her face went white as limestone. She told the men that she'd retied those knots with her own hands before Casey left home. She'd kissed that bag before he slipped it into his pocket. She'd prayed he'd come home safe. She swore that bag never left his clothing. It wasn't the kind of thing a man loans out or hides or forgets. It stays with you until it's done its job. And when she heard it had vanished, she said something the newspapers never dared print. If that bag is gone, then something took it. The railroad did not like hearing that, not one bit. Railroad companies were terrified of superstition, not because they didn't believe in it. Lord knows half the executives kept charms in their desks, but because superstition cost money. It invited fear. Fear slowed workers, cut productivity, and made men reluctant to run on tracks whispered to be cursed. So when word began spreading around the Vaughn yard that Casey Jones's protection charm had vanished, the company acted fast. They ordered silence. They told workers to keep their mouths shut about conjure bags and black dogs. They issued statements about mechanical failure, miscommunication, human error, anything that grounded the crash in the physical world. They wanted a tidy, tragic hero story, not whispers of curses lingering on their lines like smoke that wouldn't blow away. But truth has a way of leaking through cracks wider than rail gaps. By the time the sun rose the next morning, men across Mississippi were already whispering. The story traveled faster than fire jumps a cotton field. Men at remote stations said they felt chills that night. Others said they dreamed of whistles blowing long and low. One operator not far from Water Valley swore a lantern on his desk flickered, even though there wasn't a breeze in the room. The South has always listened to its dead. Simeon Webb, the fireman who lived, carried the heaviest part of Casey's story. That man didn't sleep right for months, and when sleep finally did come, he dreamed of Casey standing beside the rails, calling his name without moving his lips. Simeon claimed he heard the sound of the crash echo in his ears long after the real wreck was cleared and buried. But what haunted him most wasn't the crash. It was the humming. He told the coroner, the undertaker, the supervisors, anyone who would listen that he heard that same humming at the crash site. Not loud, not close, far off, drifting like a hymn carried by fog. It made the skin on his back prickle. When he followed the sound with his eyes, he saw nothing but broken wood and cooling steel. But the humming didn't stop until they lifted Casey's body onto the stretcher. When the humming ceased, the lantern flames steadied. The air lightened. Simeon said it felt like whatever had been watching stepped away. Now, the railroad hated all this talk. They wanted a clean ending. They wanted heroism without hauntings. So they tried to bury every odd detail. They even tried to bury the idea of the missing mojo bag. And here's where the story splits down two different roads, depending on who you ask. Some say the railroad found the bag nearby and disposed of it, burned it in the furnace to rid themselves of spiritual contamination. Men claim a supervisor ordered it burned so the story of Hoodoo wouldn't catch fire across the line. But others insist the bag was never found, not burned, not buried, simply gone, like it walked away on its own. I lean toward the latter because I've seen enough hoodoo work to know a charm that served its purpose don't stick around afterward. A protection spell that fails is one thing. A protection spell taken is another. Some root workers say spirits collect the charms they break, like trophies. Others say a bag taken from a dead man means the death wasn't accidental. And here's something the official reports never mention. The tracks where Casey died stayed cold for 3 days. I don't mean neglected, I mean cold. Men walking that stretch felt a chill underneath their boots, a cold rising up through the iron like the ground itself was mourning. No matter how bright the sun burned, the heat never touched that section of rail until the following Sunday. When the trains finally resumed running through Vaughan, engineers claimed the wheels clicked differently over the crash site. A harder, sharper sound, like the metal didn't want to speak over that ground. Some said the whistle wouldn't blow right when passing. The tone fell flat, strained, as if the engine was whispering instead of announcing itself. Casey's widow wouldn't step foot near the line after the funeral. She said her husband's spirit lingered, not out of fear, but out of unfinished duty. She repeated time and again that the bag disappearing meant his protection had been stripped away, either by fate, by curse, or by a force older than the railroad itself. And that wasn't all. For months after the crash, men in the Vaughan yard reported seeing a black dog lingering just beyond the lantern light. Never barking, never running, just watching the spot where Casey died. One switchman tried to approach it once, got within 10 feet, and said his breath froze in his chest as if the night itself squeezed him. The dog vanished before his second step. The railroad dismissed it all, called the men superstitious, said grief played tricks on tired minds. But men who live by steel and steam know the difference between grief and warning. The final straw came the night a yardman walked the tracks alone and heard a whistle in the distance. Long, low, slow, the kind Casey used to blow. But there was no scheduled engine, no headlamp, no vibration in the rail. Just that lonely whistle drifting through the pines like a memory that refused to stay buried. He resigned the next morning. See, the railroad could hide reports, burn documents, and silence workers, but they couldn't bury the truth. The truth was simple. Whatever curse had tangled itself around Casey Jones did not die with him. It slipped away into the night with that mojo bag, waiting for the next chapter. And anyone who heard that phantom whistle knew one thing for certain. The dead engineer still rode the line. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I've always believed the South keeps its justice on a long leash. Not quick, not flashy, not wrapped up in neat stories like city folks prefer. Down here, justice moves slow, patient as river water carving stone, but once it chooses a man, it don't let go. And after Casey Jones died under that engine, every railroad man from Water Valley to Memphis whispered the same thing when the night got too quiet. That curse ain't finished yet, it's just turning around. Because curses don't vanish when the target falls. Not the hoodoo kind, not the old kind. A curse moves like a storm that hasn't dropped its full rain yet, sliding across the land until it finds the next soul carrying the debt. And everyone knew exactly where that storm was headed, straight to Red McCullough. Now, nobody in the company wrote his name in the official reports, but men on the ground knew. They remembered the rivalry. They remembered how Red talked about Casey, the bitterness in his voice, the way his pride twisted into something meaner than jealousy. They remembered seeing Red's face the day Casey died, pale as milk, eyes flickering like lantern flames caught in a restless wind. And Red, instead of offering condolences or speaking a soft word to Casey's widow, disappeared from the station like he'd been yanked backward into the night. He didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't write a note. Men don't forget that kind of thing. Especially railroad men who see enough death to know respect should be the easiest thing in the world. For a few days, nobody saw him. Some figured he was hiding, ashamed or afraid, or just swallowing guilt so hard it lodged in his throat. But shame don't explain what happened next. See, Red came back to the line too fast, too calm, too ready to work like nothing happened, as one section foreman described it. But the men who worked closest to him said something in him changed. He didn't walk right. Didn't talk right. His voice lost its edge. His eyes had that hollow look a man gets after he's seen something he shouldn't have survived. And instead of acting free of the curse he'd supposedly loosed, he acted haunted by it. One engineer, old Charlie Davenport, told me Red showed up for his shift just 3 days after the wreck with grease on his hands, dirt on his boots, and fear under his skin so thick you could smell it. Charlie said Red wouldn't stand still. He flinched at every whistle, backed away from every shadow, and when somebody asked if he was all right, he snapped, "Don't you say his damn name around me. Don't you do it." Nobody had said Casey's name. Charlie didn't forget that detail. Before long, strange things started happening around Red. Nothing big at first. Tools went missing from his belt. His lunch pail turned up opened, though he swore he latched it tight. His lantern flickered even after he'd trimmed the wick fresh. He claimed the steam gauges rattled only when he touched them. Men working nearby said Red carried a smell with him, smoke and grave dirt, thick enough to make your stomach turn. Most men wanted to chalk it up to grief or nerves, but the timing didn't lie. Red wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of a tragedy. He was unraveling, piece by piece, under something none of them could name, but all of them feared. And then came the first sign nobody could deny. Red's engine refused to start. Now, engines stall all the time. Boilers lose pressure, water levels drop, fuel clogs. Mechanical life is stubborn, but this was different. The engine wasn't sick, it wasn't sluggish, it was resisting. Men said it sounded like the machine didn't want him in the cab, like the whole locomotive held its breath the moment Red stepped onto the ladder. When the firemen climbed in to help, the engine groaned to life. The moment Red touched the controls, it died again. 3 times this happened. 3. The same number of knots tied on Casey's mojo bag. The same number of knocks men claim they heard in the night after the crash. The same number of warning signs the South always pays attention to. The foreman reassigned Red to another engine to keep the schedule moving, but the second engine behaved worse than the first. Lanterns went out in the cab. The whistle jammed halfway through a blow, leaving a half-cry that spooked every horse within a half-mile radius. The coupling pin dropped on its own before Red could latch it. And once, God help him, Red claimed the brake lever burned his hand, though the metal wasn't hot to anyone else who touched it. Whatever had followed Casey onto the rails wasn't done hunting. The men who kept working with Red said he turned jumpy, eyes wide, hands trembling. Every time the train slowed, he'd look back over his shoulder like he expected someone to climb into the cab. He refused to ride alone, refused to walk the yard after sundown, refused to stand near the caboose where humming had first followed Casey. Red never admitted fear outright, but men don't need words when the truth screams through the way they breathe. Then, one night, Red stumbled into the yard office, white as bone, shaking like he'd stepped out of a storm only he could feel. His boots were soaked, not with water from the rain, though it hadn't rained, soaked with cold sweat. He tried to speak but couldn't. Finally he managed. Someone blew his whistle. Nobody understood at first. They thought he meant an engineer had passed through town. But Red slammed his fist on the desk and said, "There ain't no train on that schedule. There ain't no engine on that track. But I heard it. Casey's whistle. Long, low, calling my name." The room went quiet. Red wiped his face and whispered, "He wants something." Some men thought Red finally cracked under guilt. Others believed the curse was circling back, tightening like a noose. Simeon Webb, still grieving and fearful in his own right, told the others to keep an eye on Red. He said curses don't die with the dead. They look for new hosts, but watching a cursed man don't save him. The real unraveling began on a fog-thick night about a month after the crash. Red was assigned to an overnight run, though nobody wanted him near a locomotive by then. But schedules rule the rails, and the company forced his hand. Men who saw him walking toward the engine said his shadows moved wrong. One brakeman swore Red cast two silhouettes in the lantern light, one tall like himself and one shorter, thinner, flickering behind him like it didn't want to be seen. When he climbed into the cab, the boiler hissed without warning. Sparks rose. The whistle blew once on its own. Then everything went still. The fireman refused to step on board. Red insisted he'd ride alone. "I'll settle whatever's following me," he said. Those were his last recorded words. The train left the yard at a crawl. It never arrived at its destination. Hours later, the engine rolled back into the yard at a ghostly pace, moving slow as a funeral march. The cab was empty. No engineer, no fireman, no lantern lit. The boiler was warm, but not hot. The wheels clicked like they'd traveled miles, though no one saw it leave the rails. Red McCullough was gone. Just gone. The company wrote it up as a fall, or desertion. Said Red must have jumped or slipped or fled. But men who walked the line that night saw no tracks in the dirt, no blood, no torn fabric. And men who inspected the engine swore the seat cushion still held the shape of a body sitting there long after the cab emptied. They found Red's gloves on the steel floor, not dropped, placed, as if someone set them down neatly before leaving. And the strangest part, a faint smell of burned herbs lingered in the cab. Basil, sulfur, a hint of sweetgrass. The same smell men said surrounded Casey's mojo bag. Whatever curse Red called down had consumed him. The railroad never spoke of him again. But the men who knew the truth whispered it for decades. Casey didn't come back for revenge. He came back to balance the scales, and the curse that began with pride ended with silence. Because Red McCullough didn't just die. He disappeared into the same unseen rail line that carried Casey's final breath. And sometimes, on fog-heavy nights, men swear they hear two whistles echo through the pines. One brave, steady, belonging to Casey, and one thin, trembling, forever following behind. Folks up north like to treat ghost stories as entertainment, something whispered around a campfire or printed in the back of a paperback for a cheap thrill. But down here in the South, hauntings ain't decorations. They're reminders. They linger like the humidity, thick as a heartbeat. And if you spend any real time around men who worked the rails after Casey Jones died, you'll find out quick that his ghost didn't slide quietly into the history books. It stayed on the tracks. It stayed in the wind. It stayed in the ears of engineers who learned to tell the difference between a living whistle and one blown by something that no longer needed breath. I learned early on that railroad ghosts ain't like house ghosts or graveyard ghosts. They don't rattle chains or slam doors. They move in rhythm with the rails, following schedules only the dead understand. They appear in the corner of a cab window, in the echo of a tunnel, or in the low moan of a whistle drifting across miles of pine forest where no scheduled train should be at that hour. And for reasons nobody can explain, Casey Jones became more active after death than he ever was in life. The first sightings came within weeks of the crash. A handful of yard operators working the midnight shift in Mississippi reported hearing a whistle, long, low, steady, the exact pitch Casey preferred. Engineers know each other's whistles like mothers know their babies' cries. The sound is personal, distinct. And Casey's? Folks said it carried a loneliness to it, a proud loneliness. When engineers heard that whistle after the wreck, they didn't mistake it for anyone else. One operator at Pickens said he heard the whistle around 2 in the morning and assumed he'd missed a schedule change. He went outside expecting to see a headlamp approaching. But there was no train, no steam, no vibration on the rails, just a whistle echoing through the trees like a call for a man who would never answer again. He backed away from the tracks, crossed himself, and refused to work nights for 3 years. Another story came out of Durant. A young engineer still learning the line claimed he saw a faint blue glow drifting above the tracks just past the station. It wasn't lantern light, wasn't a firefly swarm, wasn't the reflection of anything earthly. It was shaped like the outline of a man carrying a lantern. The young engineer said the figure walked steadily beside the rails, never lifting its feet, moving smoothly as if gliding. When he blinked, it vanished. He didn't speak of it for months, but when he finally confessed, 3 older men nodded slowly like he'd just joined a club nobody wants membership in. But the most chilling sightings, at least to me, came from Tennessee, where Casey spent much of his career. Something about the hills and hollers up that way holds sound differently. It doesn't echo, it swallows and exhales in its own time. And in those hills, his ghost didn't just whistle. It walked. One fireman working the night shift near Memphis claimed he saw a man standing by the trestle just after midnight. The figure wore an engineer's cap, head bowed slightly like he was listening for something under the rails. The fireman shouted at him, warning him to clear the track. The man didn't look up. He just stepped backward, straight backward, off the trestle without bending a knee or shifting his weight. The fireman rushed to the edge, expecting to see broken bones, or at least footprints. There was nothing. No man, no tracks. Just stillness so heavy it pressed on his shoulders. Another crew member in the same area swore he saw Casey climb aboard his engine. Not at the steps, not on the platform, in the window. The reflection showed a man sitting beside him, calm and composed, eyes fixed forward. When the engineer turned, the seat was empty. But the smell of smoke and iron, that distinct scent engineers carry in their clothes, lingered long after the vision faded. Some engineers said Casey only appeared on calm nights. Others said he favored fog. One old conductor insisted he only showed himself on April nights, the month he died. But the truth is simpler. Casey showed up when the rails needed watching, when danger lurked, when something felt bent in the world's alignment. There was a report, quietly filed, quickly buried, of a near miss outside Jackson. A freight train nearly collided with a stalled engine on the tracks, but the engineer swore he heard someone pounding on the window of the cab moments before he saw the stalled train. He turned, expecting to find his fireman, or a trespasser, or anything human, but saw nothing. Yet the pounding continued, louder, faster, frantic. It saved their lives. The engineer dodged the collision with seconds to spare, braking just enough to avoid disaster. Later, he found the side of his cab dusted with soot fingerprints. Only 3 fingers. Narrow. Human size, but smeared like whoever pressed them wasn't made entirely of flesh. And I'll tell you something else that railroad companies never wanted to admit. Casey's whistle wasn't the only ghost on the rails. Men heard footsteps on the roofs of moving cars. They felt cold drafts on windless nights. They swore a second fireman worked beside them, silent, patient, steady, before disappearing in the glow of the boiler door. But Casey's presence was different. It didn't terrify. It warned. One engineer said Casey saved him, not metaphorically, literally. He was running a late-night freight through the Tennessee hills when his brakes locked. The engine started gliding downhill faster than it should have, and panic clawed into his chest. But just when he thought the train was lost, someone grabbed his shoulder, firm, steady, and pushed his hand toward the emergency valve he'd forgotten in his panic. He felt the grip like a living man's, warm, solid. When he turned around, no one was there. The train slowed, the engine lived, and every man on board walked away without a scratch. He said the grip felt exactly like Casey's handshake. Now I know you'd think these are just ghost tales told by tired men in dark cabs. But these stories didn't come from drunks or fools. They came from men who risked their lives every night trusting steel, fire, pressure, and instinct. Men who didn't spook easy. Men who would laugh off a shadow in the corner so long as it didn't touch the throttle. For them to whisper these stories, even decades apart, means something happened they couldn't explain away. I once spoke to an old engineer named Albert who swore on his mother's grave that he rode with Casey's ghost. He said he was closing a long freight run when the headlamp cut out unexpectedly. Everything in front of him vanished into night thicker than tar, and he reached for the lantern he kept under the seat. Before his fingers touched it, the lamp flickered back on, not bright, but pale, blue, like moonlight trapped in glass. And in that dim glow, he saw Casey on the tracks ahead, not blocking the way, pointing. One arm stretched toward a fallen tree lying across the rails. Without that sight, Albert would have slammed into it at 40 miles an hour. When he looked again, maybe 1 second later, the figure was gone. The headlamp brightened, normal again. The tree lay waiting like a dark tooth in a crooked jaw. Albert stopped the train, thanked the ghost, and never worked another night shift again. But the story that sits deepest under my skin came from a crew outside Tupelo. They claimed that on the anniversary of Casey's death, right around 3 in the morning, trains across 3 counties heard the same thing, a whistle blowing 3 long, sorrowful notes. Not a scheduled train, not a passing locomotive. The sound came from no direction, and every direction at once, vibrating through the rails like a pulse. And here's the part that made even the oldest men go quiet. Telegraph lines registered the whistle, not the sound, the vibration. Like something with weight traveled the rails that night, but left no tracks, no lights, no smoke, just that whistle. A dead man reminding the living that some vows don't stop at the grave. Some men said Casey was looking for red, even after death. Others believed he was warning engineers of danger, protecting them the way he did in life. A few believed the curse that claimed him bound him to the rails forever. Half guardian, half wanderer, neither free nor trapped, but eternally moving. Maybe they're all right. Maybe none of them are. All I know is this: when a whistle blows on a night with no train scheduled, and the sound stretches long and low like a sorrow that never healed, every engineer who hears it stands still, listens close, and whispers the same thing under his breath. Casey's riding tonight, and the rails hum back in agreement. Whenever folks ask me why the story of Casey Jones still hangs over the rails like morning fog, I tell them it's because some men don't just make history, they haunt it. They leave something behind in the iron and the steam and the gravel, something that don't die even after their names get carved into tombstones and their engines get hauled off for scrap. Down here in the South, we learn early that the dead don't always stay put, and the ones who die with purpose tend to linger the longest. Casey wasn't just remembered. He stayed, and I reckon he stayed because the rails weren't finished with him. You'd think a story like his would settle after a few decades, turn into folklore, fade into a ballad sung by men who never saw a steam engine in their life. But Casey didn't turn into dust like most legends do. His story sharpened with time, hardened, took on weight the way steel does when it cools slow after fire. The more years passed, the more engineers reported strange nights, strange sounds, strange feelings that followed them along the line like invisible passengers. Folks tried to ignore it, but the night never let 'em forget. A man named Ellis Crane told me once that he didn't believe a word of ghost talk until he heard a whistle in the dead of winter, cutting through cold air so thick it felt like glass against his skin. Ellis wasn't the nervous type. He fought in Europe, came home with scars that made him flinch at fireworks, but not at shadows. Yet that whistle made him drop his coal shovel mid-stride. He told me, "Beau, that sound didn't come from the rails. It came through 'em, like the steel remembered something I didn't." I asked what he meant by that, and Ellis looked at me long enough that I knew the truth was something he couldn't put into words. Some experiences sit too deep to explain. They don't make sense until you feel them yourself, and once you do, you stop doubting the stories. I had my own moment, years back, long before I started telling tales for a camera. It was late, later than anybody had business being awake, and I was driving the old highway near Vaughan, the same stretch where Casey died. The world was quiet except for the hum of my truck tires. The moon was a thin sliver overhead, just enough light to cut the darkness into shapes. I turned my radio off because something in the air felt strange, heavy, like I wasn't alone on that road. As I passed the old crossing, I heard it, a whistle, soft, distant, drawn out like a sigh through iron teeth. It wasn't loud enough to rattle the glass. It wasn't bright enough to echo. It slid into the air like breath on a cold morning, there 1 second, gone the next. But it was there. And I'll tell you right now, there wasn't a single scheduled train in that area. There wasn't a headlamp. There wasn't a rumble in the tracks. Nothing moved except my own heartbeat. I slowed the truck, rolled down the window, and listened. The world held its breath alongside me. Then the sound came again, 3 long notes, steady and low, rising like a memory from the soil. For a moment I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but a kind of awe, the kind you feel when you walk into a church at dusk and realize the shadows know your name. I didn't tell anyone for years. Some things are easier to keep between yourself and the night. But that whistle stayed with me, echoing in the back of my skull whenever I heard a train pass through at odd hours. It reminded me of something my grandfather used to say, "A good man don't die. He just changes shifts." Casey never left the rails because the rails never let him go, and the men who worked those lines understood that better than anyone. Every April, engineers kept quieter. Conductors checked their couplings twice. Firemen looked at the shadows between cars just a little longer. Not out of superstition, but out of respect. Respect for the man who died saving a train full of strangers. Respect for the signs he left behind. Respect for the parts of his story that couldn't be printed in newspapers because they belonged to a different kind of truth. A truth that breathed. A truth that watched. A truth that still rode the line. I remember a conductor from Memphis, old boy named Leonard, who said he once felt someone sit beside him in the cab. Didn't hear footsteps, didn't feel weight shift the cushions, just felt that unmistakable presence, the way you can feel someone watching over your shoulder without turning around. Leonard didn't look, didn't breathe too deep, just kept his eyes on the tracks until the feeling lifted. Later, he said, "It felt like a man who knew the rails better than me. A man who wasn't there to scare, just to see if I was paying attention." Another engineer claimed he heard Casey warn him, not in words. Words belong to the living. Warnings from the dead feel like pressure, like something nudging your hand before you realize why. The man said he was approaching a curve when he felt his arm being pulled toward the brake. He hesitated for half a second, long enough to wonder if exhaustion was fooling him. But he trusted the feeling, eased back on the throttle, and braked gently. A tree had fallen across the tracks just beyond the bend. He said if he hadn't slowed, he'd have plowed into it at full speed. I didn't see nobody, he told me, but I felt him like a shadow standing close enough to breathe my air. Men didn't talk about these moments publicly. They saved them for quiet nights and bourbon glasses. They'd lean back, stare into lantern glow, and speak in that tone between fear and reverence. Not because they were scared of being mocked, because they didn't want to disrespect something bigger than themselves. Some spirits demand silence, not out of cruelty, but out of pride. Casey was one of those spirits, and the longer the years stretched, the more his legend grew legs, but not the exaggerated kind folks put into tall tales. No giants or devils or flying trains, just the steady, patient stories of a man who refused to abandon the rails he died protecting. Men in Alabama heard him. Men in Tennessee heard him. Men all the way into Arkansas heard him. Sometimes the whistle came during storms, sometimes on clear nights, sometimes when the moon was a slit of silver, sometimes when it hid behind clouds like a lamp under a blanket. But always the same notes, always the same pitch, always the same feeling crawling up the spine of the man who heard it. That feeling wasn't terror, it wasn't dread, it was the weight of responsibility. The quiet reminder that vigilance saves lives, that the rails demand respect, that the dead still watch the living, especially the ones who stand where they once stood. I've come to believe Casey's ghost wasn't trapped. He wasn't suffering. He wasn't cursed in the way folks think curses work. I think he stayed because something in him was tied to those rails tighter than flesh ever could be. Loyalty, maybe. Duty, maybe. Or maybe he stayed because unfinished stories rarely let go of the people inside them. There's a stretch of track near Vaughn where people swear the ground hums differently at night. They say if you stand still long enough, the stones vibrate under your boots in a pattern that feels deliberate. Not random, not wind, deliberate. Like footsteps echoing through your bones instead of your ears. Folks claim the hum spells a rhythm, slow, then quick, then slow again. The same rhythm of a man checking his brakes, testing his throttle, adjusting his engine's pulse the way Casey always did. Now, I'm not asking you to believe all that. Belief is your business. But I'll tell you this. The South don't keep stories alive unless those stories keep themselves alive too. Ghosts fade when forgotten. Legends die when ignored. But Casey Jones's story, it never dimmed. It never weakened. It never slipped into silence. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, men used to gather quietly near the old line. Not in crowds, not in ceremony. Just a handful of engineers standing with their caps in their hands, listening, not for the living trains, but for the dead one. And more years than not, they heard it. That whistle, low, mournful, proud, rolling through the pines like the night itself, breathed it into existence. And every time they'd nod knowingly and say the same words my grandfather said before him, and his father before him. He's still riding, just on a track we can't see no more. The world keeps turning, engines got quieter, rails got straighter, men stopped carrying lanterns and started carrying radios. But none of that stopped the ghost from riding. Some things don't bend to progress. Some stories don't update themselves. Casey Jones left this world with a hand on the brake and a warning in his whistle, and I reckon he stayed because men still needed him, needed the reminder, needed the eyes watching from somewhere just beyond the edge of lantern light. So if you're ever out near the tracks on a night when the air feels strange and the wind holds its breath, and you hear a whistle that don't belong to any engine on the schedule, don't run, don't hide. Just stand still, listen, and tip your cap. Because some men die heroes, and some heroes keep working the night shift. Casey Jones never stopped. He just stopped needing steam.